see my screen okay? Yep, great, thank you. So, um, we're gonna be doing this training with our team here from AFC. It's gonna be myself, Alex, I'm the director of the Post-Secondary Readiness Project, and we have Juliet, who will just be providing some technical assistance, is our assistant director on the project, and Oriana Golferini, who will be helping out as well, is also on our post-secondary readiness team at AFC. So just a little bit about AFC. We are a agency that primarily provides legal support to students and families in K through 12 education, helping students with disabilities secure services, proper placements, IEP support, and our team at Advocates for Children specifically focuses um, on transition supports and helping older school-age kids as well as young adults to prepare for what happens after school, as well as getting to graduation and as well as getting to graduation. So you can reach us through our helpline, which is available as listed on the screen, and you can always email us and we'll share our contact info towards the end. So, next slide. So what we're going to be talking about today is we're going to talk a little bit about disability, but we're just an introduction to the topic of college access and students with disabilities. Then we're going to talk about how does disability play a role? How does disability play a role with regard to the college you select? What do different colleges offer? What are different types of college programs? So we'll talk a little bit about that. We'll talk about some tips for what to do when you're searching for a college program, what could be some issue spotting, how to prepare for selecting the college. And then we're also going to talk about disability accommodations in college, very, very big topic. What do disability accommodations in college look like? What are typical options that are available? How do you apply? And things like that. And then we're going to talk about some general college supports as it relates to disabilities. What are some best practices in things that students and families and students with disabilities can access when they're in college or as they're preparing for college? So I'm just going to touch very briefly on the next slides. This is just some general information that basically there's been a lot of growth just in the last decade or two in terms of students with disabilities attending college. The National Department of Education generally states there's probably more than 1 million students overall with disabilities attending college. And one thing that's unique and important for our local area is that CUNY has a very, very significant population of students with disabilities. As you can see, there's a very large number of students who are registered, and that means a lot. It means that students with disabilities are going to college. They're finding a way. They're attending. They're getting the support they need. But that also means that there's room for growth, and we know, and as you'll see as we go through this training, there's things that CUNY could be doing that could be better or provide additional support. And on the next slide, you'll just see a basic breakdown of some of the disabilities. This is data that CUNY releases. What this really goes to show you is that across the gamut of students with disabilities, all kinds of students with disabilities do attend college, and regardless of what type of disability you have, there's an opportunity for you to become a college student in the future. But as you can see, very, very significant numbers of students with learning disabilities. As you can see, very, very significant numbers of students with ADD or mental illness, which probably account for looks like more than 50% of the students attending. So so it's something to understand. Regardless of your disability, there's a way that you can attend college. with the right supports, of course. So the next few slides really start getting into the bulk of the presentation, which is what programs are available, what does college search look like? One thing that I want to mention up front is this is a very disability focused training and webinar. We'll be speaking primarily on disability focused issues. And what that means is we're not going to cover a lot about the general college application process. We're not going to cover a lot about general tips for applying and kind of college search things. So there's a lot of information on that. We do only have an hour today. So most of this is going to be very disability specific and things that you need to know in addition to all that general information about applying to college. So this is one of our first substantive slides. So when you think about different college programs, what's the best way to think about it from a perspective of disability? And we've kind of identified it here into three different buckets, or here, as you can see, columns. And I think it's a good way to think about it. So as we're going to talk further in this training, the ADA sets the bare minimum. It's no longer the IDA. The ADA sets the bare minimum for support that you're supposed to receive from a college with your education. So, and over the entirety of universities that receive federal funding in the United States have to abide by the ADA, and they provide a certain subset of accommodations. That's kind of that is something that is standard, and that's the beginning. I would like to call that the base, right? What a general university provides you as far as disability accommodations. Then the second category, which is a general education college setting that has additional supports. So there are some schools that have decided to embrace a greater level than what is generally required by the ADA in a college setting. And they have access to learning specialists. They have certain coaching resources. They have resource centers. When you think about that, there's a good amount around the country, maybe a dozen or two. When you think about Delphi University, they have a Bridges program. This is a specific academic coaching type program that is available for students with disabilities. So it's kind of specialized. So you don't just get accommodations, you also get additional support through an academic coach and additional tutoring. Similarly, Hofstra has an Hofstra University has an additional program that is available called PALS, or academic coaching. And then there is Mitchell College, which is one of the premier schools serving students with disabilities. They have certain things, sometimes smaller classrooms, sometimes they have special resource centers, special tutoring. So this category encompasses a list of schools that go beyond the ADA standards. The last category is really a much more limited category, but this is schools that have specific classes, specific programming for students with disabilities. When you think about Landmark College, you think about, universal principles of design learning. You think about material being adapted. You think about specialized programs for students with autism and others. There's much more limited number of schools that are doing this, that have designed their curriculum and their general education program with students with disabilities in mind first, and incorporating those levels of supports. Now, the ADA does not require that you do this. This is something that some schools have done because they know there are students who have different learning styles who need this. Now, Landmark College is a school that provides bachelor's degrees and various other degree credentials. I have listed on here also the Melissa Regional CUNY Unlimited program. This is in a slightly different category of programs. These are programs that are specifically designed for students with intellectual and developmental disabilities. So this is not your typical program. When you think about this program at CUNY, the way it's implemented, and is very limited now, but CUNY is going to be expanding in the next years, is students are generally participating in general education classes. So the classes are with other students, but the assignments, the instruction is different. Professors and the classes that are available through this program have been informed and taught and trained that they are working with a subset of students who have higher needs. And we'll talk about something called fundamental alteration a little further in the training. So other programs across the country do fall into this category. They're generally accredited by an organization now being called Think College. Think College accredits programs that are for students with IDD, students with intellectual developmental disabilities. And this also, at CUNY, generally, it's in partnership with AHRC and OPWDD. So not only are you having slightly different assignments in your classes, not only are you being graded on a slightly different scale, you also have someone, a student coach, a student mentor who accompanies you to class all the time. So you're receiving this very, very significantly additional level of support. And even in the Melissa Reggio CUNY Unlimited program, not all the classes are general education classes. There are certain classes that are specific to the students in that cohort. Now, these are things you should consider at the very highest level. Which level of support do I need? Can I function in a general education setting with some accommodations? Hey, I know my learning style. I need greater supports. I need somebody to be more hands-on. I need a weekly meeting with the coach, or where do I fall into this? And then you look at the different schools. We're not going to go through them all, but I'm touching on some of the things below, which are additional considerations. We're going to, in the next few slides, we'll talk about campus inclusion. Community makes a really, really big deal. You're going to a big school, right? Sometimes in your high school, you might maybe had a couple hundred kids or 100 kids, thousands of kids attend college. You want to make sure that the campus is inclusive and accessible, and that's another thing to consider. Additionally, very important, last point on the slide is additional supports. Columns 2 and 3 cost additional money. They are not part of your general tuition. If you want to participate in the Bridges program, if you want to participate in an academic coaching program, schools do charge additional money for this. That is because it does go beyond the EDA, and schools know, they know that, and they provide a lot of additional resources, coaches, special centers, tutors. Some of these things cost additional money, so they cost money. Now you can pay that privately out of pocket. You can sometimes take a loan. There's also Access VR, which we'll talk about in the future training, which is a state agency that helps pay for college for students with disabilities, can cover the cost. And then there's also OPWDD. So something to think about, there's an additional cost to these components. So for the next slide, I'm gonna pass it off to Ariana to talk more generally about college search and things to think about as you're making the decision of where you want to go to college.
Yes. So as Alex said, we're going to be talking a little bit more about like college searches. Obviously, these criteria on the slide are important for all students, right? But it's especially important for students with disabilities to take these into account, and also to be mindful of your disability and the specific needs that you might need when you're looking at a general, before you even get into the coursework, right? Of just the general size or location or where it is and how to get there, and the accommodations that the school provides generally as you make your choice. And we'll get more into the coursework and specifics in the next slide. Thank you, Alex. So I wanted to make a few points on this slide, or we did. One is it's important to consider the disability and the accommodations that you might need or your student might need, as well as like understanding, right, that your strengths or challenges, and really making sure that the school can provide that for you. Because right, they're trying to sell you on their school, and sometimes it might be a little bit more of a investigative situation to make sure that you're really getting what you need out of the school, and advocating and making sure that they can support you with what you need specifically, as well as figuring out if that college, right, the college choice aligns with what you want to study or your career moving forward. Obviously, figuring out career goals should also be starting in high school, right, in your transition period, but also focusing it during the college search is important, because it might be a little bit difficult down the line to change careers and the supports that you have set in place. So, and then speaking of professional long-term goals, it's important to focus on coursework requirements and what those look like, especially connected to your disability, and the accommodations, because as we'll see in future slides, it's tough to change those down the line when you've already had your college selected moving forward.
Cool, thanks, Ariana. Actually, I'm going to stay on this slide for half a second and say, it is college is a different world. It's less customized. It functions under different laws. If you're going into a program that you say, well, maybe they'll cancel a class or two for me, or they'll waive it because of my disability, that is generally not how it works. Not only is that not common, that technically is not supported by the law, and the law and colleges don't really do that. There are certain accommodations and changes that colleges can make, which we'll talk about. But I really want to stress the point of being realistic. I myself am a quadriplegic. I am going to share this story, but I also, on one hand, I'm going to share the story, but I'm, going to tell you, maybe you don't have to follow this advice because maybe I shouldn't have. I was in a car accident when I was 19 years old. I was a student at Carnegie Mellon University studying engineering, and I became a quadriplegic. So I lost use of my hands and kind of sustained my disability at that point in life. I made a decision at that time, hey, quadriplegia in engineering is not a match made in heaven. And I changed my career choice to becoming an attorney, which is what I've been doing for the last 20 years or so. Now, when I look back at that decision, do I think it was right or wrong? I don't really know. Knowing with the supports that are available today and how much digital technology is available for engineering, maybe I still could have been an engineer. Honestly, I was fearful. I didn't know what could have happened, and I made that choice for myself. But this is a conversation that you want to have with yourself when you're selecting a college program. And honestly, leading to my next slide, this is not a conversation you need to have by yourself. It's very important to get answers and to know what college you're selecting before you do so. That means knowing what the course requirements are. Will you be able to fulfill all your requirements? Knowing how long a program is. Knowing what disability accommodation supports are available. Are there lab components to your profession? Are you becoming a nurse? Is there a practicum that you have to pass down the line? These are all things you really need to know. I encourage you, from a general perspective, all colleges generally have admissions offices, academic advisement, and they will talk to you as you are doing your college search. Now, there is one area that is a little bit trickier, which is if you want to reach out to a university or college disability service office before you're admitted or before you apply. From experience, I will tell you, they do not always want to speak to you and you tell them, okay, I have XYZ disabilities, this is what I need. Can you give it to me? A lot of times they will say, hey, look, it's case by case. I don't know. Why don't you, once you're enrolled, we can have that discussion. It's a thing that a lot of college counselors face, and we've done a few trainings and this has come up. And, it's kind of difficult. You can't force the college to disability office to make a decision or give you an exact determination before you submit your documentation. And you can't submit your documentation before you enroll. What I always encourage is ask for informal meetings, ask about generally what you offer. If you're persistent, they will talk to you. One of the most interesting kind of opportune times to speak to a university is after you've been admitted. So you submit your application, you receive an admission, but you haven't accepted the decision yet. That's a time where a lot of students and families can reach out to the university and say, hey, look, I'm thinking about deciding, but I have real concerns about my disability. I really need to know what's going on. And a lot of times the offices will be more favorable in terms of hearing you out then, kind of having a more detailed discussion. It is not, unfortunately, there's no one major national standard on what disability college accommodations look like. There's some common themes and some industry best practices, but I will tell you, having done this work for 5 to 10 years in various forms, different schools definitely offer different things in terms of their level of support, and the way that they interpret something like note-taking is very different from college X as opposed to college Y. So you want to get as many answers as you can to these questions before you make the decision, because once you're enrolled, once you've got a semester in, once you're paying tuition, it's really challenging to undo things or go in reverse. Um, the other thing that I really think is a great option is talking to other students. Reach out to other students with disabilities. Sometimes disability service offices will connect you. Hey, you can talk to this student, you can talk to that student. You know, networks, there's network of students out there where you can find students that have experiences. They can truly explain to you and give you, hey, this is what worked, this is what didn't work. Okay, so this is a quick overview of college search and kind of college programs as we get into the topics of disability accommodations. So we're going to talk about this generally at first. I already explained the ADA requires colleges to be accessible to students. It's a very different threshold than the IDEA, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, which is what you all may be used to since you're working with us at AFC, which is special education and K through 12 education. So there's a big shift in the burden and in how accommodations are done. As you know, in special education and under the IDEA, it's the school's responsibility to find students with disabilities. It's the school's responsibility to put a FAPE, to give a free appropriate public education. The school has a lot of responsibilities under the IDEA. Now, when you go to college, it changes. We're going to talk about some of those changes in the next slides. But just to begin with some, it is the student's responsibility to request an accommodation. The school will not reach out to you. The school does not know if you have a disability. You have to disclose, you have to apply. So we're going to talk about what that application process looks like, but that is very important, big distinction. Then it's also on the student, the responsibility to prove that you need an accommodation. It is not that you're entitled to it. If you need extended time on exams, you need to have medical documentation, other documentation to show that due to my disability, I have these issues with concentration or whatever else, and then you are granted the disability. So you have to reach a level of proof to show that you're entitled to it, which is very different than generally with kids with disabilities in the K through 12 system. So we're going to talk about some differences a little bit more here. The IDEA is focused on a good education, right? How do you define what a fair, appropriate education is? ADA in college, very different. It's accommodating you on tasks. You need some help with writing, we'll help you with writing. You need some help to level the playing field with extra time on exams, we'll help you with that. So it is it's a task-based system that is not based on the overall quality of your education. The environment elements in college are also very different. In K through 12 education, you can have a smaller class size, right? It can be determined that you function better in a class size that is 12 to 1, 8 to 1. You need ICT, integrated co-teaching. That's all possible. In college, it does not work that way. Whatever the class size is, whether it's 30 students or 100 students, that is the class that you have to participate in, and it is not a requirement of the college to provide you a smaller setting, whether you can prove it or not. The curriculum is another big difference. So in K through 12 education, schools and special education educators are required adapt materials, give it in different formats, a whole array of different tools and tactics that are used to adapt materials to kids with various disabilities. College settings, general college settings are not the same. Whatever the professor presents as materials for everyone is the same instruction and materials you are required to. Is the same standard you are held to. Very important, the term fundamental alteration is going to come up more in this training, but I want to say it. Universities do not, this comes from the law, universities do not have to make I'm going to go to the next slide just for a second to read it. Institutions are not required to lower or substantially modify essential standards or academic requirements or make adjustments that fundamentally alter the nature of a service, program, or activity. So that means you can, if you're asking for, hey, this essay is too long for me, I can't do 10 pages, I want 5 pages, that is a fundamental alteration to a program. Hey, I'm not really good at this calculus class, can we skip the trigonometry or the derivative pieces? You cannot ask for that. That is a fundamental alteration. If you can't participate due to even a physical disability in a certain nursing component, you can't perform a certain task in a nursing class, that is a fundamental alteration to a program. So the program requirements cannot be changed. Schools do not generally change them. They help you fulfill the task, but they are not changing that program requirement. Um, Again, supports, as I've mentioned, in special education, there's a lot of additional supports, a lot of related trainings. Um, 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 College, it's just accommodations. They are working with you on a task by task basis to make sure you can do so. There's another element that doesn't really exist in the special education space is administrative financial burden. Even if you prove that you need a certain accommodation, if a university wants to show that it's a major administrative or financial burden, they can deny your accommodation on those grounds. You don't see that too often. Colleges are pretty okay. They tend not to use that too much, but once in a while, if you are asking for something that is such a big challenge, even let's say you show that, remote learning is something you really need, but the school is not set up and it's very difficult to do remote learning, they will say, hey, this is too big of a burden for us to create a special section and a whole special program for you just because of one accommodation. You don't see that often, but it's something to be aware of. That is not something that K through 12 schools can generally say. So also, I say this kind of bluntly and candidly, but most IEP services are not offered in college. So many of the things that you see on your IEP, different placements, therapies, different other kind of things, related services are not offered. It is the accommodation section of the IEP, whether it's testing accommodations or classroom accommodations that are generally offered in college, but that often is not the biggest section of the IEP. And last but not least on this slide before we move on is your IEP as a document is not determinative of what services you'll receive in college. A lot of individuals often, submit, hey, I need XYZ accommodation sports college. They hand in their IEP. That is denied pretty much 100% of the time, give or take 95, depending on what additional documentation is included, because what you had on your IEP was under the IDEA, it was under a completely different educational setting, and colleges will say, the IEP is not determinative for us, nor is it mandated for us. We can use it just to understand your history. It can provide context, but just because your IEP says you need to get this, that is not good enough. That is not sufficient at a college level for you to get the same level of service. We're going to talk about what is sufficient. We're going to get into the documentation that's required for an accommodation in a few, but I just wanted to touch on that. So some other really important things to think about before we get into some of the other accommodation pieces. All accommodations are individualized. You're going to hear this throughout the training. Everything is on a case-by-case basis. Depending on what your doctors or your medical or your healthcare team says, hey, my disability limits my concentration. Actually, I have a mobility challenge. You know what? Because I have an exacerbation of a stomach condition or a digestive kind of disability, I need this, or maybe you have anxiety and my anxiety plays. So it's individual. Just because two students with the same condition, whether it's autism or learning disability or anxiety, apply, it is not guaranteed, nor is it likely that they will be granted the same accommodations. When that documentation comes in and the Disability Service Office reviews it, they look at what are the limitations? What can you not do? What does your disability limit you from doing? And how can we fix those things? It is not a diagnosis-driven review process. So again, we talked about this. Disability accommodation, I'm just going down the slide a little bit. Disability accommodations are based on the functional limitation. Disability accommodations are based on equal access. Very important to understand, disability accommodations in college are not meant to create an unfair advantage. If you need, if you were granted an accommodation to submit a 5-page paper when the rest of the class is submitting a 25-page paper, that's an unfair advantage, and that is generally what the law does not protect. So I've covered some of these at a pretty high level. Obviously, these get a little bit into the weeds as you get into more complex accommodations. We're going to talk a little bit further down about temporary and permanent disabilities. Permanent disabilities have a very specific review process and how that looks. And then if you have a temporary disability, maybe you broke your leg, right? You're going to be disabled for 3 months. Maybe you have cancer and you're going through treatment. Those have a review process as well. And you can also have accommodations granted based on temporary disabilities. So again, this is just part of the deck. I'm not going to cover it too much. This describes much more in detail what's an appropriate accommodation. kind of, this is the standard of the law is written by certain of the guiding principles in college disability accommodations. And then it talks about temporary accommodations, whether you've undergone a surgery or things like that. So those accommodations tend to be time-based. So they'll grant it to you for a semester, and then you have to submit additional documentation if you still have an ongoing impairment. So this is a list. I'm not going to go through all of them, of some common college disability accommodations that are offered. So on here you have things like extended time in exams. This is probably the most common college accommodation, right? For a lot of students may need a different setting also. Hey, you can't be in a class of 100 students. There's an aspect of your disability that it has to do with focus. So you make a request, you have a private room setting, or you have a much smaller room setting. Breaks during exams. Sometimes there's a disability reason, college exams can be 3-4 hours long. Why you need a break that doesn't count against the clock, that'll be granted to you. Note taker, very big, very common disability. Hey, sometimes it's difficult for certain students, if a professor is lecturing for 2 hours straight, for them to listen, synthesize, and write all the information down. So you'll be granted a note taker. ASL is pretty common. ASL would be granted by most schools if you have if you're deaf or hard of hearing. Assistive technology, which we're going to talk about in a few slides, very big. Colleges are very big on assistive technology. And I think it's important to realize and understand that, in the sense that on one hand, it seems like, hey, why am I not getting a specialized teacher? Or why am I not getting the supports that I had in K through 12? At the same time, when you go to your professional job, when you have your career in the future, you won't be having those level of supports. And assistive technology is hopefully a way that you can bridge the level of support that you need. Now, there is a fine tension between, hey, this assistive technology is technology and it can only do so much. And colleges will sometimes, give you a voice speech recognition system, be like, well, maybe you need a scribe, maybe you can't write very well. Well, we're not in a place to give you a personal writer all the time. We'll give you this speech to text technology. Those are dialogues. That's part of the interactive process that I'm going to talk about in a few slides, but those are conversations that you need to have at the college level in terms of what you need. Last but not least on this slide is housing accommodations. Yes, if you're going to be staying in a dorm, if you need to be alone because you can't live with someone because there are certain elements of your disability to prevent that, those are things that you can request. You need to be closer to campus. There's a whole array of college accommodations that can be granted. And also accommodations for activities and experiential learning. This means that college must provide you accommodations, not just for your classes, internships, special programs they have, activities, events, anything the college is doing. In theory, they have to provide you accommodations to make sure you can access that program. Very important point. So here's a list of some more accommodations. I'm not going to go through them, but these are some common ones. You'll get access to the slide. Afterwards, I will say, I will say proudly, this list has expanded over the last 20 years. As the U.S. Department of Education, as certain colleges have done some of these things, it's become much more common to see some of these. I will say, unfortunately, not every college offers the same level of accommodation. It is possible that you go to a certain college and you go, well, I need this. And they go, well, we don't offer that. And you go, well, XYZ college offers it. They go, well, we don't. Now, could you take on that college and maybe file a complaint with the U.S. Department of Education or do other things? Sure, there are legal means. I will say it is not a guarantee from having done this work that you will get that granted. Plus, are you really going to put off your college decision while you're engaged in that kind of advocacy? Of course, we're advocates for children. We strongly believe in advocacy. I think in the college setting, it is important to try to make the best choice for yourself. If there's no other means but advocating and kind of taking to legal means, but by all means, you should do so. But from personal experience, I would say it's probably not the recommended approach. It's a lot of time. It can take a lot of effort, and there's no guarantees, because if somebody determines that, hey, that school is providing something that goes beyond the ADA, or it's a burden for this school, you may not get that accommodation granted. I'm going to touch briefly on, I know we have about 15 minutes left and we started a little late, so I'm going to go through these a little quickly. But these are some of the harder college accommodations to get. What does that mean, harder to get? It's not difficult for the school to implement some of these, but they're harder because you really have to justify at a high level that you need extensions for your assignments, for example. Look, most of your assignments are assigned weeks in advance, if not a month in advance. So for you to get that as an accommodation, what is it about your disability that makes you, when you have a month of lead time, not able to submit that assignment on time? It's a pretty tricky assignment accommodation to get. Look, if you have an exacerbation within the line of your disability, you have a condition, you're hospitalized a week before, they'll grant it to you. But schools generally don't grant, hey, you get a month or 2 weeks more to submit an assignment than anyone else. Alternate testing formats, hey, this is an essay. Hey, I'd like to request multiple choice. I do better multiple choice. Really, almost never granted. It's considered a fundamental alteration to what you're supposed to know and understand. And I'll just touch on remote learning. Remote learning became very hot, obviously during COVID. Everybody kind of was participating remotely. That has become a much more difficult accommodation to get if the school's not providing it. If the school says, "Hey, that was an emergency situation, but you need to be here to learn in person. The learning environment's important." It can be pretty tricky to get remote learning. I'm not going to say it's not granted, but it's become a pretty high standard that you would be granted remote learning. So we spoke about assistive technology. For the purposes of time, I'm not going to stay on here too much. Assistive technology, very big deal in college. Screen readers, note-taking apps, digital textbooks, very common accommodation. You want your textbooks in e-format. You want to be able to read them so you don't do well with paper hardcover books. That's an accommodation that's commonly granted. So something to really, really think about. We could do a 3-hour conversation just on assistive technology alone. Admissions process. I'm going to give the very high level overview of this slide. You can request accommodations as part of the admission application process. So if there's an essay or there's an interview or something you have to do as part of the admission process that your disability requires, you can reach out to the admissions office and say, I need this accommodation. That is separated from the accommodations you get once you're enrolled. Once you're enrolled, you go through the disability service office and they review your application, and that's what you'll get. What you get in advance as part of the application is a separate process. Disability as an accommodation in general as a factor in admissions is not counted. The law generally prevents schools from taking disability status into account when making admission decision. So whether you think it's going to hurt you or help you, it generally is not something that counselors are trained or they want to know as little as possible about your disability. Unless you're blatantly writing it in your personal statement, no information will be shared based on the accommodations you received or anything else. Disability services generally don't participate in the admission process or in the application process office because a lot of students will reach out. I worked at Columbia University disability offices. They want to have a conversation. They want to get to know you through disability service. I tell them this has no impact on your admission process. That process is blind to those reviewing it, and it's put that way in place for you to be protected. Sure, we can have a discussion about what enrollment, what generally is available to you, but we cannot help you with admission. We can't put in a good word for you. Your disability doesn't help. There are no disability quotas. That's generally not how it works. Not in general. We're talking general colleges. So moving on to our next slide, just very quickly, you can also get accommodations. All these things play a major role, and it's important for you to take advantage of all these things. These are different things that don't per se have to do with coursework. The financial aid office may have certain understanding on funds you can receive. There may be career services office, career service, that's toward the tail end of your college education. Sometimes they're very nuanced with disability and employment, and sometimes they're not. I'll be honest, some career offices really don't know what's going on. There might be mentoring programs where students can mentor you in colleges. Take advantage of all these things. These are all things that are available in addition to the classroom, in addition to your accommodations that could potentially help you be more successful and help you deal with any challenges you have due to your disability. So I'm going to keep going. I'm going to keep burning through this. So I'm going to cover these last 10 slides or so pretty quickly. Again, we discussed the student must initiate the disability request process. I highly recommend you talk to the Disability Services Office first. This is after you're enrolled, admitted. It can be helpful to know what you're requesting and what they offer. Sometimes you engage in that conversation and you learn things about the office and they learn things about you. You can provide additional context in a meeting for the disability counselor that will be ultimately making the decision. Documentation is required. All documentation is reviewed on a case-by-case basis. Last but not least, interactive process. This is a very interesting legal standard where you actually have to engage in a discussion. So you apply for X accommodation, school says, well, for this class, it's really difficult due to this reason, but we can offer you something similar. You come back, you say, okay, that works. Or you come back and you say, hey, that doesn't work for me. I need the accommodation that I requested. So legally, you're supposed to engage. Just because the university offers you a different version of accommodation and you say, no, I'm going to sue you, that generally would not live up to the standard of being reviewed by a court or the Office of Civil Rights, Office of Civil Rights of the U.S. Department of Education. You have to try to work it out with colleges. Again, temporary disabilities, this is about standard of review and why it's very difficult at times to say, hey, I have a friend with autism who got this. It doesn't always work that way. So temporary disabilities and permanent disability are treated differently. If you have a physical disability or you have a mental health disability or you have another disability, it could be a different standard of review because it has a different functional limitation. Hey, if you're asking for extended time on exams, that's considered a pretty low bar, pretty easy accommodation to get. That's a different accommodation type and a different standard than if you're asking for a multiple choice exam or you're asking for an extension of an assignment, or you're asking for note-taking service. So every accommodation is connected to your limitation and they have different standards, right? Different classes. Hey, you have a lab class in nursing, but hey, we have just a basic English writing class. Those will have different accommodations that can be granted based on the class activities. So there's many, many factors that play a role, and the strength of your documentation is very important, right? So if you have two students with the same disability, but one comes in with a doctor's note and documentation that's a paragraph long, and then you have another one who submits a neuropsych from 3 months ago, and as well as a history of all kinds of conditions and services, that's a much stronger application. The burden is on you to prove that you need this level of support. So documentation plays a big role, and I want you to, I cannot tell you that enough. And honestly, I would be not telling you the truth if I told you that someone with significant limitations, like for myself, a quadriplegic, right, who's a power wheelchair, I have all kinds of different issues, and then somebody comes in with documentation that maybe doesn't have a long list of limitations, but has very specific needs, whether it's a dyslexia issue or some kind of other phonetic or learning disability issue. The college takes that into account and says, well, what exactly does your disability impact? And again, certain disabilities tend to get certain accommodations while others don't, even though it's case by case. This is the general overview process. I'm not going to spend too much time on this. This is you apply, you have to disclose. You can meet with an accessibility counselor, you submit your application, and disability services will give you a response. Generally, it takes 3 to 5 weeks. If you're starting in September, I tell everyone start in June. If you're coming in first semester September, please start in June. You want to be ready for day one. I know too many students that wait for mid-semester to be like, holy cow, this college thing is complicated. It's difficult. I need accommodations. They submit then. It takes another month for it to be approved and put in place. And then they go a whole semester without their accommodations in place. It's a long process. You might get denied. You might get not denied, but they might ask for additional accommodations. So there's all kinds of factors that I encourage you to start early. Again, this is a little bit about documentation. Documentation should be recent. For certain disabilities, 2 to 3 year old documentation is fine. A lot of times what I see with mental health conditions, anxiety, those kind of conditions, that needs to be much more recent. The Disability Service Office wants to see that you're actually seeking treatment right now, that your condition is currently active. There's certain conditions that are known medically that aren't always active, right? They might be episodic or intermittent. Disability services may ask, hey, we want something recently from a healthcare provider. Again, your IEP is not sufficient. I can't stress this for you enough. You need to get recent updated documentation. Very important for learning disabilities, LD or ADHD. A lot of schools will require a neuropsych. So they want to know exactly how your condition plays out. They'll want a recent neuropsych evaluation, or at least one that's a few years old, not from when you were 5 years old. So that can be difficult to get. It costs a lot of money. But you should be aware of it. It's possible that a treating therapist can write a brief letter that'll grant you some accommodations. But if you really want the highest level of accommodations with those kind of conditions, whether it's LD, ADHD, mental health, kind of things that fall into those categories, you'll need to get stronger documentation. And last but not least, accommodations denials are very common. So it's unfortunate, but if your documentation or your proof doesn't raise to a certain standard, I've seen a lot of accommodations get denied. Students get additional documentation, they reapply. Sometimes, most of the time, they get approved. This is just going to be in the slide. I'm not going to talk about this, but this is standards that colleges look at for your disability documentation needs to include. Confidentiality, all your data is secure. Your professors will know that your accommodations are granted, but they will not know what your health condition or disability is. Disability information is only in only in the disability service records. It's not on your transcript. No future employer, nobody will ever know that you got disability accommodations. I've had this happen too often where students, are trying to be like, I got this, I'm brave. I don't want anyone to know. Oh, there's a stigma. I tell everyone it's confidential. I encourage you to get the support, apply for accommodations, even if you don't use them, have them available to you. And I've seen students who plan really well, they get the accommodations approved, and maybe they use them a semester later or 3 semesters later, but it's good to have them in place and have them in your arsenal. You don't want to be in a situation where you're like, oh man, why didn't I apply? I really struggled in this class. Can have a really long conversation on this, but there are resources out there. Let's say you come in with disability documentation that's old or it's insufficient. Sometimes the Disability Service Office will grant you temporary accommodations. They will grant you 2 months. We'll give you this for 2 months. We understand. We see what's here. But if you don't get us better documentation 2 months, this is denied. So a lot of Disability Service Office sometimes have clinics that they work with. They can refer you. Now, they do not pay for it. It is on you. You have to cover the cost of getting the documentation and the assessments, but there is an array of things that you should, resources to you, if the main reason you're getting denied is you have trouble getting documentation. There's an appeals process. You get denied. You can appeal to usually the medical director or some administrator. You can apply to some other directors. Eventually, you can take your case to court, but this is just so you know that your denial is not the last stop. You do have rights. Additional supports. I'm going to get through these slides pretty quickly. This is a CUNY specific slide. All things that I really, really encourage students to take advantage of. Counseling centers, CUNY Leads, which is a specialized program that helps students with employment. There's writing centers. This is a CUNY example. Every school has a lot of other additional resources that don't say the word disability on them, but they have a lot to do with challenges or limitations that students with disabilities see and experience. So college is very different. It's not always one building where everything is. One building is 5 blocks away, one thing's in another place. You really have to get an understanding for these resources are and use them. They can be incredibly helpful. Financial aid, we're not talking a ton about that today, but Pell and TAP and other scholarships are available for traditional students, are also available for students with disabilities. Access VR, Commissioner for the Blind, OPWD do provide funding for certain funding for tuition. It doesn't mean if you're going to Columbia University and it's a $80,000 a year tuition that they're going to pay that, but they do provide for state and city schools some support. Okay. And it's important. There's certain nuances about if you're a part-time student, whether part-time student with a disability, whether you can still get financial aid or not, but in most cases in New York State, you can. So last slide, college best practices. You must engage and take advantage of the supports, writing centers, tutoring, extra credit. It's the #1 thing that I see students struggle with at times. They don't take advantage of college supports and then they fall behind. It's very different than K-12 education where special education comes to you and everything's in one classroom. You really need to think about that. Another thing is to get to know your professors, go to office hours. The relationship with professors is so important. You may be in a class with 100 students and the professor has no clue who you are. And later you end up getting a C or you fail a class. and you never went to those office hours. If you go to office hours, you show the professor you're working, you show the professor, hey, you disclose I have a disability, but I'm trying to do my best. It goes an incredibly long way. And the same is I've seen students, professors almost regularly offer extra credit, especially in undergrad classes, and students don't take advantage of it. Be engaged, take advantage as much as you can. Dealing with difficult professors, I put this disability in quotes. You do not see this often, but it happens. Some professors are resistant to even if the disability service office says you're granted recording class, right? Because you have a disability where you need to review they go, no, I don't let that happen in my class. I don't want my lectures recorded. Or disability services grants you extra time. Professor goes, no, everybody takes it in the same place. I'm not doing it. You don't see it often. That is a situation where you really need to go to the disability service office and let them fight that fight for you. It is each college's university's obligation to get their professors in line and make sure they're following the law and providing accommodations. And last but not least, two things. Professors will not chase you. It's very different. You need to talk to your TAs, talk to your professors, talk to your academic advising staff, tell the disability services office you're struggling. You have to take the initiative. It is a very, very important thing and a big change when students go to college. And lastly, have a good plan. A lot of times students, one class is one day in the morning, next class in the afternoon, next day in the afternoon. Have a good plan, have time management, develop study skills, be organized, plan ahead. Hey, I know this semester I'm taking calculus. Next semester I have to take, writing composition 2, and I need to take a philosophy class. Know your course requirements. Be organized, stay ahead of your work. It's very difficult to fall behind in college. There tend to be less assignments, but they tend to be much bigger. Also, on the same note, it's difficult to go backwards in college. If you have a difficult semester, you paid for that semester, you spent thousands of dollars paying tuition and other things. Now you want to redo. It's difficult to redo classes. 2, you'd have to pay for it again. So the stakes are very high. Make sure you get off to a good start. Don't waste your first semester. I really encourage you to plan ahead. Do not try to transfer from K through 12 education and think it's going to be the same thing in college. It's not. So our next webinar is coming up. I'll just leave this here for you. This will be talking more detailed about job training, employment opportunities, and Access VR. So here are some resources for you. I'm going to take a quick peek at the chat and the questions. All right, so I see 2 questions. I'm going to answer them. Yes, we will be sharing the handouts. So what type of accommodations do students receive between 504 and ADA? That is a really, we can have like an hour or 2 long conversation on that. I will say, they're very similar. It's very different. 504 in K through 12 special education, only plays a role in certain kind of physical access or in meals cases or certain other general access things. In colleges, there is no IDEA. So there's section 504 and there's the ADA. And a lot of schools will treat it similarly, to be honest. They've almost been combined together in terms of what they say and what you can get. And a lot of that is much of what I described earlier. 504 tends to do a little bit more physical access and kind of leveling the playing field. The ADA is more some of the academic supports that you may need or academic accommodations. I'm happy to have a larger conversation on this. If it matters, email me, reach us at Advocates for Children. I can definitely outline more of the differentiations of 504 and ADA. But for purposes of this and time, I'll just leave it there. Based on your experience, which is one of the more inclusive community colleges and universities? I mean, I think CUNY is great. I think CUNY does a good job. Now, CUNY doesn't offer what Adelphi offers in terms of an academic coaching program, but they have learning assistants and other kinds of academic tutors that if Access VR pays for, CUNY can arrange for you. I think CUNY has a pretty good disability culture where they're open to accommodations. They're open to having lots of students with disabilities in classes, so they're used to it. I will say some of the elite colleges still have a long way to go. I mean, the Columbia University is the world. They're so stuck in their requirements. We don't change them. It only works this way. It can be a real battle to get them to be more flexible. I think the CUNY Community Colleges, Nassau Community College, I'm just talking in the tri-state region, do a really good job. There are national universities, when you talk about Villanova, when you talk about University of Chicago, when you talk about some of the work being done in North Carolina, those are like state-of-the-art, quote unquote, schools that provide very significant levels of support, in dorm, residential support services, personal care services. They provide all kinds of tutors and special centers where students with disabilities can go study and receive supports. So around the nation, there are really universities that are leading the way. I think here locally, it's a bit more challenging. You don't always have that level of support, but Rockland Community College, for example, has an IDD program that they call Bridges. There is all Queens College and all the CUNY colleges have CUNY Unlimited. Hofstra has a program that I described earlier. So, we can absolutely share a list and talk about some places. I mean, I think NYU is like a really great example where in the last 5 years, they've launched really special programs for students with autism and some other additional things. So it's a much longer conversation, and inclusive actually means different things to different people. So I'm a person with a physical disability. Am I really going to go to City College? City College is like a CUNY school that's on a mountain. It's got like stairs and hills and incredibly difficult to get around. That might be a decision that I may make. That's not inclusive for me, but then for someone else that might be inclusive. So yes, high school transition coordinators are absolutely supposed to help with college enrollment and the process. I will say this varies greatly from DOE school to DOE school. Every transition coordinator is unfortunately not as knowledgeable. The IEP should absolutely have college goals, 100%. You should be writing those in. What are you going to 2-year college? Are you going to 4-year college? Are you getting a credential? Again, one thing that I didn't mention is when you're in an IDD program, when you're in a Think College CUNY Unlimited program, you're generally not graduating with a degree. You're graduating with a credential or certificate of some kind. So something to keep in mind. You think I'm going to finish CUNY Unlimited, Melissa Reggio, I'm going to apply to a job that has a bachelor's degree requirement. That is not the credential that you get there. Those are things that you should think about in the planning process. Those are things that you should think about those are things that you should think about in your IEP and in transition planning. Last resource I'll throw out is transition access and college access centers. Sorry, TCACs, transition college access and sorry, mess up what they stand for. Transition and college access centers. Within the DOE, they have a lot of good general information and some good disability information. Where to apply, good lists, how to get fee waivers, a lot of things that we didn't discuss today. We did not discuss the general college application process. This was very disability focused. So I encourage you to reach out to your TCACs in the situation that your transition coordinator at your school maybe is not as engaged or not as informed. And we as AFC are here as a resource, especially in cases where you've been denied accommodations in college or you're concerned about certain things. We're here. Reach out to us through our helpline. Say you have a college issue. Say you heard this webinar. You'd like to get more information or you'd like direct support. So with that, I finish it off. I hope this was useful to you. I'm sorry I rushed through a little bit of it because we started a little bit late today, but I hope the information helps you. Again, it is very nuanced. Reach out to us. Any questions that you have, by all means. We are also open to doing these trainings for other in other venues. We are doing one for CACNY, which, as you know, is a college network. We did a college access training for CUNY Network of Success, which is an organization that work within CUNY. We want to spread the gospel as much as we can about college access for students with disabilities. So to close it out, I'm going to ask you all to please take a survey. How well did we do? So I'm going to send that in the chat. If you can just hang on for 1 second, I will send that over. Tell us what you like. Tell us what we should cover more of. Tell us, maybe information that you didn't find as useful. We will take all that advice, and by you filling out the survey, you really help us in terms of our ability to do better in the future. So here we go. Now it has been in the chat. Please click on it. Take a few minutes. We'll just hang out here. You can also complete it afterwards. but I don't want to close the meeting so that you guys use the link. Anyone who registered for this will get a copy of the deck and the slides. And the webinar will likely be going up on AFC's YouTube channels. You don't see the link. I just sent it. Did it not come through? Ariana, do you see it in the chat? I just resent it. It's in the chat.
I see it.
Okay. I'm going to send it to you directly. Did it come through now? Oh, I see what happened. Okay. Boom. There it goes. Sorry about that. Now everyone should have it. It just said host and panelists. So my apologies. And I just stole 2 minutes of your time with that. I'm sorry about that. While we're closing out, you guys are taking the survey. Anyone else from the AFC team want to add anything? Anything I missed? I know we went at a pretty brisk pace. I'm going to stop screen sharing so you can see us. As you complete the survey, feel free to log off. If you have any additional questions, feel free to send them in the chat or in the Q&A. I'm going to stay on for another minute or two. And we do have the March 5th Access VR and employment training coming up, which is part of our AFC transition webinar series. And then we have another one coming up, I believe, in May or June on OPWD, navigating employment and adult decision making. So we have more webinars coming up on these topics, and yeah, feel free to join us. And aside from doing trainings and doing direct casework, AFC and our team does work a lot on policy advocacy. We're working very closely with the DOE and CUNY and other places to increase college supports for students with disabilities, make sure that students know this information, make sure students are confident and knowledgeable in advocating for themselves, knowing what their rights are. Very, very important. It's not something we talked about today. We went very deep in kind of information, but self-advocacy is a huge, huge deal. A lot of students, if they had this information, they would utilize it. But if you don't know what you don't know, you think, I can't go to college. I can't get an accommodation. This isn't right for me. So self-advocacy, really, really big deal. And those are courses that need to be built in through the K through 12 education. So I see we still have 1 or 2 attendees on. We'll let you just finish. Thanks so much. Grateful for your time and feedback. Oh, I see another question just came in. Oh, can I recommend a book on self-advocacy? Now that is a really great question. And I can say not right now, but if you send your email in the chat or directly to me, I will take it. And I will talk to some of our other attorneys and staff at AFC and see if we can recommend something to you. That is a great question, and I'm sorry for hyping self-advocacy and being unprepared. All right, I think with that, we are going to close out this webinar. Let me just save our transcript so that we have it. Let me make sure our recording is all good. Stay safe out there with the weather. We wish everyone a good night. And thanks for joining us. Till next time. Take care.